Hello and welcome to this video on transgressive criminology, human rights and state crime. As a quick recap, the key themes that we are looking at in this particular topic is power, harm and the interconnectedness of the world. Nation states and large corporations have the power today to inflict serious damage on citizens, other countries and the environment. The third subtopic we need to consider within this topic is state crime. There are various ways in which we can define state crime. Chambliss puts forward the idea of state organised crime. So by the state, here we're thinking about governments operating within their national borders or boundaries, and they're engaging in an organised form of crime, they're planning it, they're engaging in activities which are going to further their agenda. Or we can use the work of Green and Ward. State crime is illegal or deviant activities perpetrated by or with the complicity of state agencies. What's slightly different here is that idea of complicity. So states may be aware that criminal activity is occurring and turn a blind eye to it because it furthers their agenda in some way. So state crimes are committed by or on behalf of states and governments in order to further their policies. It doesn't include acts that benefit individuals who work for the state, however. So for example, if a police officer takes a bribe, that is not a state crime. However, if that police officer has been commanded to do something by those who are in power, that could be potentially considered a state crime. It's a big area of interest in particular for Marxist sociologists, as they see governments as acting in the interests of the bourgeoisie or the ruling class. They here would look at things such as war crimes, which can be committed by individuals, groups or governments, again in order to further the needs or interests of the bourgeoisie. Or we consider here the role of genocide, which refers to the systematic use of violent crime against a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. The key term there is systematic, is the idea that it is highly organised, highly structured, almost mechanical or industrial in the way in which it takes place. What we find is that war crimes, firstly, are punishable under international law. It's interesting to consider that something as chaotic as war actually has rules, actually has laws which govern it, and international law are laws which all different states around the world have signed up to. And so technically when conflict breaks out, we are supposed to have some sort of structure to it in terms of what you can and cannot do. War crimes committed by the state include things such as direct attacks against civilians, so the state is able to attack enemy troops but not enemy civilians. Torture or inhumane treatment of prisoners, so if people do get captured, they must be treated humanely. Taking hostages is illegal under the Geneva Convention. Using civilians as shields, so that would be placing civilians in military complexes to prevent them from being bombed. So for example, if you had an arms factory, you couldn't fill it full of civilians in order to protect it. That would be a war crime. Using child soldiers, and this is something in particular we see unfortunately used in parts of Africa and South America, or the settlement of an occupied territory. Now this is unusual as well because in the past our understanding of war was that it was about fighting for territory, but today, post 20th century, we generally find that it's not about claiming territory and you're not actually allowed to settle occupied territory. So if you invade the enemy and you perhaps capture a piece of land, you can't bring your people into it and start settling it and saying, well, this is mine now. That is very much of the past. Today, that's something that would be considered a war crime. Now, what's interesting about the concept of war crimes is they are still actually fairly contemporary as an idea. The trials of Nuremberg after the Second World War was an example of where people were held account for their activities. Here we're talking about the Nazi government and the officials that were still alive after the collapse of the Nazi regime at the end of the Second World War. These individuals were held to account in a trial by essentially the world saying, you perpetrated these activities, you did these things, these were war crimes. Those people responded by saying, well, actually, I didn't want to do these things, I was just doing them because I was told to do them. And for the first time in history, it was decided that simply saying I was working on orders, this was no longer an acceptable reason to commit some sort of atrocity or war crime. The trial of the former Yugoslavian president Slobodan Milosevic, who died in custody in 2006, was another example of this. So he had engaged in a number of different activities which were considered war crimes, and the people underneath him had been captured, and ultimately they were given more lenient sentences because they gave information which helped to his capture and he was held accountable for it. However, he was never truly punished because, as we see, he died whilst in custody. But also after the collapse of the Iraqi regime following the invasion many years ago, we had Saddam Hussein who was captured. He was the head of the regime. He was held accountable and held to trial for gassing Kurds in his own territories. previously, historically, would have been something that perhaps people would have overlooked because it would have been said, well, they're his own citizens, he's allowed to do what he wants to do. But today, under 20th century rules in terms of war crimes, that is not acceptable. And so ultimately he was held to account for that, and he was hung. Now, it's difficult and controversial to decide who has committed a war crime, because what we often find is there are other acts which have occurred at the hands of various states, in particular Western states, which aren't considered a war crime despite the fact that they were particularly devastating. So the dropping of atomic bombs on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War by the American state, despite the fact it was a devastating attack, it was a weapon of mass destruction that was used, many civilians died, in fact primarily civilians died, this for some reason is not considered a war crime. Also in the Second World War, the RAF engaged in the firebombing of Dresden, which was a German city which, whilst it did have an important strategic role in producing arms for the Nazi regime, at the same time, there were large numbers of civilians who lived there who also worked in the factories. And so the RAF decided to firebomb it to try and cut off the power of the Luftwaffe, and yet this isn't considered a war crime. Also, George W. Bush's and Tony Blair's war in Iraq is also considered by many a war crime because it did not receive international support, and yet today very little is discussed about this, and to be fair, these individuals are very unlikely to ever be held to account. So the understanding of what is a war crime and what isn't a war crime is still up for debate, and it very much concerns where you are fitting in the kind of power structure of the world at any particular point in time. Now we need to consider genocide. If we need a definition of genocide, it's the deliberate and systematic use of violence against a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. And again, just to highlight, that word systematic is very important because it means it's being done in an organised, structured, professional, almost industrial, mechanical way. The most famous example being the genocide perpetrated by the Nazis against the Jews during the Second World War, although it is worth, of course, saying that there were other groups involved in that particular act too. The systematic killing of Jews and others in concentration camps and death camps was something that hitherto had not been seen in human history. So the way the Nazis engaged in the murder, in the concentration camp management, and ultimately in the kind of destruction of the bodies afterwards was something which was unique. It was industrial. It was almost like the production of a product. Instead, in this time, it was about producing death on a mass scale. Other examples could include in Rwanda in the earlier part of the 90s, we had two ethnic groups that engaged in a conflict. One was far superior in terms of its firepower than the other, and essentially what we saw was an ethnic cleansing, a genocide against a particular group. So roughly 937,000 Tutsis were murdered by Hutus, and this is often considered a genocide. In Darfur in Sudan, there's been ongoing conflict since 1983. More recently, there's been an attempt to try and end the conflict by splitting the country into north and south, but still, this has not quite ended that conflict. What we see there was that Arab shepherds and Janjaweed militants, so we think about Islamist militants here, have sought to wipe out 80 black African groups. There is to date roughly, or many consider, 2 million people considered to be dead, 4 million people displaced, countless thousands tortured, injured and raped. And so again, this is considered a genocide. But it's been very difficult in all of these cases, barring perhaps the situation with the Nazis, to hold people to account for various reasons. As sociologists, we're interested in how state crimes are possible. Human beings, generally speaking, have a strong sense of empathy, so how are they able to engage in war crimes and genocide? Well, Cohen decides to borrow Max's concept of techniques of neutralisation to show how governments use the same techniques as people to explain and excuse their actions. So we saw before how Max has said that when people engage in criminality or deviance, they will explain it to themselves in a certain way to neutralise their guilt. And what Cohen is saying is that actually governments do exactly the same thing. So they may, for example, deny the victim, say that the victim were terrorists, so therefore they deserve to die. They may deny injury, say actually those people that we've attacked, they started it, it's self-defense, we have to look after ourselves, it's defense of the realm. Denial of responsibility, we were following orders. Now we know after Nuremberg, generally speaking, this isn't an accepted defense, but nonetheless, governments often use this language. Condemning the condemners, saying that other people are picking on you or victimizing you, that actually you're the victim, so that we should receive some sort of understanding, that we should be perhaps supported even. Or appealing to a higher loyalty, so saying there's a bigger cause, there's a higher cause, and sacrifices are inevitable. Various examples could include how the nation of Israel claims that what it does in order to protect Jewish people. We have various Islamist organisations that claim what they're doing is to protect their religion. And we even find Western states will say that they're engaging in certain activities to defend democracy. Kelman and Hamilton examined how social conditions in modern societies can lead to horrific crimes being committed. They looked in particular at the My Lai massacre, which was an infamous incident during the Vietnam War where 400 civilians were massacred by US soldiers. So essentially what you had was American GIs going into a village, My Lai, and they got all the people out into kind of the main square and one by one asked them if they knew where the Viet Cong were. And the Viet Cong were the enemy at this point in time, the people that they were fighting against, sort of guerrilla fighters, if you will. And when each person said, no, we don't know any members of the Viet Cong, there's no one here, we don't have anything to tell you, the GIs just killed them all indiscriminately. And now this would be considered a war crime, and so we need to consider, how, again, is this possible? Is it simply techniques of neutralization, or is there something about modern society that actually leads individuals to be able to do this sort of thing? They identify 3 features that can result in crimes of obedience, that is, doing as you're told, and this seeks to explain how these crimes occur. First, we have authorisation. This is where acts are ordered by someone in charge. Very famously, and we've looked at this as part of research methods, Stanley Milgram demonstrated this principle in his electrical shock research, how individuals, how humans, in many ways are inherently obedient to authority, that it takes very little for a person to assume that someone else is in a position of authority. And if that person appears to give you the freedom to do a certain thing, even if that thing goes against conscience, you will do it. So normal moral principles are overruled by the need or desire to obey authority. We often just want to do as we're told, and as soon as someone sort of seems to indicate that you are being told to do something, it makes you feel, well, I don't have to worry about the guilt of this. I can kind of put that on the shelf and I'll do as I'm told. And this is exactly what we see in Stanley Milgram's work on obedience. Next, routinisation. This is where pressure from the hierarchy, organisation or governments turns the act into a routine, so it can be performed again and again, and increasingly the more you perform it, the more detached you become from it. So, best example of this was the use of waterboarding in Guantanamo Bay. This is a torture technique, but is technically sanctioned and technically legal. So you strap the person that you want to extract information from onto a sort of piece of metal or onto a piece of wood, and you mean that it means they can't move their limbs, and also they can't raise their head. You then place a blanket over their face, you lean them back so all the blood starts to rush to their head, and you constantly pour water over their mouth and nose. What this means in this scenario is that they cannot choke, they cannot drown, because the way the lungs are protected in that regard, there's going to be air in them, and what you're therefore doing is simulating drowning without the person ever actually being in any danger of drowning. Although there have been occasions where this has actually caused heart attacks in the individual, but generally speaking that's very rare. And so in simulated drowning, this causes the person to panic, to become fearful, and the hope or the belief therefore is that when you then bring them back up and ask them the question, they're going to tell you the truth. And what we find is that in the United States, in Guantanamo Bay, which is actually in Cuba, it was an area that the American government rented from the Cuban government, where this was taking place, they used the same soldiers to do this again and again and again, and by doing it over and over, it turned into a routine. And as it becomes a routine, it becomes something that you can actually almost ignore or forget. So if you think of a routine in your own life, something that you do every day, it becomes so routine that you're able to almost do it without thinking. You're able to do it on kind of autopilot. And that's exactly what happens here, and it's exactly how these types of war crimes are able to be committed. Finally, we have dehumanisation. This is where the enemy is made to look as non-human as possible. So for example, you take your enemy and you might, for example, refuse them clothing, you might shave their hair off their body, you may, for example, cease to call them by their name, you give them an ID number, and by doing this, you therefore take away all their human elements. They become just an animal in your eyes, they become just an object in your eyes. And this makes it much easier to do the unpleasant thing to them, whatever the unpleasant thing might be, whether that be murder or whether indeed that be torture. The best example of this, once again, comes from the Holocaust, so the Nazi regime's attempt to essentially eradicate all of Eastern Europe's Jews. And what happened here was, large amounts of Jews were rounded up, they had their hair shaved off, they had their clothing taken away, their jewellery taken away, they were tattooed with a number, and this meant that the members of the army and the members of the force controlling the concentration camps and death camps were able to see these people not as people, but simply as objects. So when they did torture them or when they did murder them, it didn't affect their conscience. Bauman argues that the features of modernity that we've discussed previously, such as science, technology, the division of labour and so on, all help to create conditions where such acts have become more acceptable and common. So again, going back to the Nazi example with the Holocaust, it was a mechanical industrial scale style genocide that occurred, and it was built on the back of this dehumanisation and routinization process. That's it. Thank you very much.